G'day to everyone that's joining us online, and thanks to everyone that's here in Wellington. My name's Daniel Hedderfin, and I'm the chair of the RTSA's New Zealand branch. So this evening in New Zealand time, we've got a presentation coming up from Rudolph. But just before I introduce Rudolph and his presentation, a couple of things. So the RTSA New Zealand chapter has been pretty active this year with lots of events online, and that's been really successful for us. We've had over 250 people online at some of those events, and I think tonight we're going to have hopefully over 200 people subscribing too. We have a lunchtime event coming up on the 23rd of November, so an invite for that will be coming out soon, and then we have another evening event. So that will be the RTSA's wrap up for the year, and we'll be doing that in conjunction with the TrackSafe, which is around level crossing safety, and they're in New Zealand and an Australian organisation. They'll have an awards ceremony that they're going to do with us. Plus, we'll have a couple of interesting technical presentations. So hoping lots of people can get in person to Wellington, Auckland and Christchurch. We'll be simulcasting and have a group of people at that. So that's the Thursday, the 3rd of December. So I'm sure people are aware COVID has disrupted things around the world. And one of the things that disrupted was CORE, Conference of Railway Excellence, this year in Perth that was to be held. So as part of that, it's been rescheduled to next year. Touch wood, and most of the presentations hopefully that we're going to occur next year will be able to be rescheduled over for Perth middle of the year. But to keep people's interest and to make use of the good work done by the presenters and those that wrote papers, RTSA has been organising something called Core Connect. So that's to do presentations or parts of presentations on some of the papers that were accepted for the postponed core this year. So this presentation is rail bridge health performance. So I'll let Rudolph talk about exactly what that all means in just a sec, but just a quick introduction for Rudolph. So Rudolph Kotze is the professional head for structures at KiwiRail, New Zealand's network rail provider. And he's responsible for technical standards and strategy for KiwiRail structures assets. He's been involved in bridge and structures designs for over 30 years in asset management, working in South Africa, then New Zealand, then Australia, then New Zealand again. So I think 1996 he came over here.
The year after the World Cup, yeah.
After some unknown event in 1995. So Rudolph is the technical lead for bridges, tunnels and various other structures, including mechanical facility pedestal stands. Most important,
yes.
Rudolph.
I put a special slide in about that. Yes.
Yes. Something dear to my heart. So we'll take it away from there, and there'll be questions at the end that we'll do with the group here and online. We'll have a way of facilitating those. Thank you, Rudolph.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks. Thank you, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to present today on what we've developed over the last 4 to 5 years in KiwiRail, in the structures section. It's all about the structures health. So I'm quite privileged to be standing here and presenting that to you. I was told apparently that there are quite a few Australians online, so I'm not allowed to use words such as rugby, Bledisloe Cup and those sort of things, so I won't go there, but let's move on. As Dan said, I joined KiwiRail in 2016, and one of my key KPIs then when I joined was to develop a world-class, as it was described in my job description, asset management system for KiwiRail, and in particular to digitize what we had then from a paper-based system to a digital system. So I did that with trepidation, I have to admit. But also I had sort of the backing of many years of work in the asset management field. I worked for NZTA as an asset owner. I also worked as a consultant for NZTA looking after their Wellington bridges. And early days, in on-track days, I also worked on assets there. I think that scared me quite a bit at the time, but I have to say, 20 years later, the structures have actually improved tremendously. So in Australia, I did quite a lot of work in the research area for deterioration modeling, and also looked at the Australian road authorities, how they did their condition assessments and what condition state profiles they used, how they did their risk assessments, and how they presented all that information, in many cases digitally. So I had that experience, and I also did a lot of work personally in inspecting bridges, developing a small software system that did all that. So when I joined KiwiRail, I had a couple of concepts that I wanted to test and put into practice, knowing that it can work, but knowing also this is a much larger, more complex organization. So getting to where we've come to, it's been a team effort, so I need to acknowledge a number of people. So one of them is Mike Keenan from the structures team, senior bridge engineer, and he's done an incredible job in putting together the concepts from the early days into a system now which is all fully integrated and working. So he's not here tonight. I'd like to have said personal thanks to him. The structures team and the regional teams, the inspectors, it's quite unique. We still have in-house inspectors and gangs doing maintenance. That's really, really good. And so they've had to go through quite a bit of change. And amazingly, they've come through very enthusiastic about some of the changes we've made. So that was quite a big tick for me. And then not least is the Maximo asset management system, the data team. They've been really a great support to make sure the systems all integrate and work. Now look, before we go much further, this is a complex topic. Structures is complex, and then asset management is even more complex. But I thought just to get everybody, and there are quite a few older people, ancient, in the room. I don't know what's online, but for those of you who've forgotten all your previous mathematics in engineering, I thought we'd just do a quick refresher to get us all on the same page. And I'll start with the simple equation, 1 + 1 = 2. In engineering terms, it always is 2. In the accounting world, it could be whatever you want it to be. Yeah? But let's stick with the basics. 1 + 1 = 2. So just moving along on that. And you need to put your brains into working mode now. We did also do things about the Lin functions. Some of you may remember this, but hopefully it's coming back. And we had things that had series equations there. So that expression we had in the beginning, we could really make it much more simpler, easy to understand, more scientific. And in that form, I just love it. But we can go further. We have the cosh functions, which is the same as the cost after a couple of years, but and then we could go further. We could actually write that all into that equation, substitute. It looks like that, which is not exactly what I wanted. But then also we had the factorial functions, as you remember. John, you remember that? And we also had matrices to solve equations. That's inversion, transposition. If we plug all of that into that equation, I'll go through this very quickly now. We get to the point where we can say that is a far more professional and elegant equation. Now, if you understand that equation, you will understand the rest of this presentation. But I will give you a hint there, and that we will go back to the bottom one there, which is 1 + 1 = 2. And I do believe keeping things simple, and so hopefully you will be able to follow everything I say. Okay, moving on to the topic. So it is not possible in 45 minutes or so to give you a total picture of what we're doing or what we've done in the last 5 years. I'll give you some background to why we're doing it, the benefits, and talk to you a little bit about the asset base. And again, I'm saying I don't know who's out there in cyberspace, but some of you may know this, some may not, but that's something that you need to understand about KiwiRail. And why we go for a risk-based asset management framework. I use that poster, which was on my wall, just to remind me always of what we're dealing with. And seriously, we don't want to end up there. We have these disasters numerous times a year. Major bridge collapses happen. We read about them, we hear about them. We don't want to be in that position. Then I'll just touch base on the development and implementation of the system. I'll just run through a quick example, and then some of the sort of ongoing initiatives that we're busy with at the moment. Just going back to 2016, when I started, KiwiRail embarked on a couple of things, and one of them was putting together this strategy or framework for improvement. And three things stood out to me, and that was simplify, standardize, and invest. And I did realize that as an engineer, we really need to change our language into the corporate language. We need to move away from the massive spreadsheets of 10 decimal place equations and trying to overwhelm them with all this information, but actually start talking the language they understand. So we use those three concepts in any decisions we made in developing this framework. So, and it still is valid today, and it's still a test of time. Now, KiwiRail is an asset-rich organization, and as such, we have quite comprehensive asset management systems in place. I put that up there not for you to read, it's just to indicate that it is complex, that all the functions and requirements of ISO 55000 and other systems are embedded in there. And in the boxes I've colored in red are the ones that we've been working over in the last 5 years. It does also embed the normal life cycle of an asset. You probably equate an asset with a human being. It sort of follows the same process. I'll explain later. Taking a step back again to 2016. In 2013, KiwiRail wrote an asset management plan. In 17, 18, 19, while we were developing this framework for structures health, we were also developing a new asset management plan. So the two went sort of parallel, and we were fortunate to make sure that we sort of made sure that what we were writing in the asset management plan, what others were writing, that we could match and dovetail into. So at the moment, we published an asset management plan in last year, and that is now the basis for our next 10-year sort of investment program. There are 4 pillars in all of this, and it's very standard sort of, corporate speak, but there are 4 pillars, and one of them is the framework, which is the standards and the procedures and those sort of things. And we've done quite a bit of work in that space. When I say we, I'm talking about structures, asset management team. In the data space, we've done a huge amount of work, and I will touch base on that again later. And then in the field, again, we've digitized the information we capture into tablets, into iPads. By the press of a button, really now, the data is fed back into Maximo and is immediately available to the engineers. So we've done a lot of work there. There's a thing at the bottom there called predictive modeling, and that is something which is an aspiration at this stage, not really an aspiration, it's something we have to be doing, but we need data to do that. And what I've learned in Australia is that, yes, you need a lot of information to be able to do accurate predictive modeling, but that's something for the future. We're just going to be focusing right now at the now. And then the asset management plan was an output of all of that, and yes, we've written one, and it now forms the basis for a lot of the things we go forward with. Part of that asset management plan is the sort of 10-year network renewal strategy. And really it starts with the customer. And I'm just going to read that out because it's important. Outcomes are for reliable, resilient, and safe transport for goods and people. So that's what we do. We make money out of transporting people and freight, and the customer needs to be satisfied. There's a line of sight between the customer right through to financial. So once the customer needs are known, we can look at the network. The network has to deliver what the customer wants. And then we look at the network and we say, well, actually, there are a bunch of assets there. Bridges are probably one of the, well, in my mind, bridges are the most important assets, apart from the pedestals in the shunting yards that Dan is so worried about. But really, we have a lot of assets, and they have to perform to a certain level to make sure the network works and the customer is happy. And then it goes down to the point of, well, actually, someone has to pay investment to make sure all of this works. That financial bit is the key question that we as engineers, asset engineers, have to answer. It's not how strong the bridge is, that is part of it. The key question always comes down to how much do we need to spend on what bridge, when, and why? And the why is becoming more important. We need evidence to actually justify why we get money. I think a very important part of this document has been the very short summary at the bottom, where it talks about reliable and resilient networks. Now, reliability is something we can really see, and know and calculate. Resilience is a more complex thing, and we experienced that in the Kaikoura earthquake. We know the importance of what it means to be resilient, what happens if you get a big event like that. So resilience is something that needs to be evolving, but it overarches a lot of what we do in any case. And then the bottom bullet point talks about safety and health of people and the natural environment. So I thought this really encapsulates in a very succinct way what we do and why we do the things we do. Okay, as far as the asset base goes, we have a very diverse asset base. And I guess some of the key things people might not know is that we are the biggest tunnel operator, owner in the country. We have more than 100 operational tunnels. We have 1,700 bridges, and they range from small little bridges to major viaducts. We have 40 of those major viaducts in our network. And this is where it gets interesting, because our average age of our assets, as opposed to NZTA, which is like 40 or 50, young ones, ours is 80. That is pretty old. So I sort of term my professional title as the aged care professional head, because that's what we're doing. We're looking at a lot of old bridges and assets that we need to make sure they remain fit for purpose, but then have a plan to actually renew or strengthen or enhance to the point where they can still fulfill their function. Some of these bridges were built in the late 1800s. The railways was forged through the North Island, and they are still operational, and they still carry current trains and boats. Well, certainly not here to teach you how to suck eggs. Everybody knows about the deterioration models or the curve. You get a new asset, it deteriorates. It's like a body, it's like a person. You know, you get born and then you start deteriorating. So you need a bit of maintenance along the road, make sure that that gradual deterioration gets sort of under control. But then you get to a sort of a minimum level of service where you need a hip replacement or something serious needs to happen to you to make you work again. And then we go into the cycle again. So that is, in theory, a very simple concept, no problem. On the asset management strategy side, to do all that, we've got certain ways we can do it. We can replace a light bulb every year, regardless of whether it's working or not. You just replace it. Then we know it's going to be always in a good condition. Or you can let it go right down to the bottom where it started flickering, and then you decide, well, I better do something about it. In between there is like a sort of a risk area, which you can say, well, that's where we want to aim to be. It's in a proactive risk-based asset management process. When you go behind that intervention threshold, you are going to be having certain restrictions placed on you. You know, either temporary speed restrictions or load restrictions on your bridges. And if you can live with that, fine. But if you can't, not a good model for you to follow. The two things on the left there, intervention threshold and performance measure, easy words to pronounce and understand. But if you start thinking about to quantify those, that's where it really becomes interesting. And that's where part of the challenge lied with us when we started this process. I do not expect you to go and read that diagram. All I want to say here is that apart from all the mathematics and all the rest of the stuff, the technical things, we had to do a rearrangement of the organizational structure to actually fit what we wanted to achieve. And in Australia, not that that's the be all and end all, but generally you have a level 1 inspection, which, for example, is a safety tick and flick inspection every year to make sure the bridge is still there, that the components are still working, that nothing's seriously wrong. Previously, KiwiRail did a lot of the condition rating during the annual inspections. So we had to make a distinction between what is safety and what is asset management. And so we came up with that model, became the roadmap from 2017 onwards. And to a large degree, we've been following that, and it is still valid as we speak. I put the button there, the push button, just because at the end of the day, some of the questions that were leveled at us in 2017 came from people who said, well, actually, can you tell me what is the your crappiest 6 bridges or 10 bridges in the network? And also, can you tell me which is the worst scour ones you've got, and how much is it going to cost, and when do you want to do it by? And I want the answers by tomorrow because the funder wants to know. But at that stage, it was a paper-based system. All that information was there, was in a cupboard, in a report, handwritten, beautifully handwritten, by inspectors who really know their job. They do know their job, and if you read those reports, it's like reading the story of the bridge. But it was not accessible. You couldn't actually extract that in a very simple, meaningful way. So a lot of data was available, but we couldn't push that button to give the answer. And that became our, wouldn't it be nice if we could have a button, a system, we can press a button and the answer pops out. It's a simple goal, isn't it? I mean, really? That button is worth a lot of money. Moving on to the actual risk score framework. We started at the right-hand side, which is the output, and we really asked ourselves and our clients and our customers and the exec and say, what questions do you want us to answer? We're not talking about mathematical stuff. We're talking, what do you want to know from us as engineers? And the answer was really simple. We want to know how much are we going to be spending, what are the risks, and how do we prioritize this work? That's all they want to know, really. And so we thought, well, actually working back from there, what data do we need to capture? And some data we've been capturing for years and we've never done anything with them, with that data. So we said, well, let's just cut back on what we collect to the bare minimum that we need to answer those questions. So we looked at the input side, and condition assessment is really one of the key things we need to do. And that I learned from Australian road authorities and other organizations there. They do that. They've been doing it for years. There's a condition rating system, 1 to 4, etc., etc. We need to know how strong these bridges are. We need to know whether we can run heavier trains on them or more frequent trains. Then we have environmental, what I call environmental risks, which is scour. We lose more bridges to scour than to seismic or any other reason in a year. It is a real risk. Seismic, as we've learned in Kaikoura and other many earthquakes in New Zealand, that's another risk factor we need to somehow quantify. Then we have steel fatigue and also concrete fatigue, but mainly the steel structures. We know that they are prone to fatigue. Some of them, given the ages, they may be coming to the end of their fatigue life. Foundations were put in there because, unlike other jurisdictions and we still have a lot of timber piers. We don't rate them strength-wise or anything like that, but hence we put a factor in there that said we need to actually find a performance measure to say a timber pier is either capable of handling these loads or not. What are the functions we're going to be looking for in the deterioration of that pier? Having done all that, we then said, well, we need to write standards, which we've done. We've done a standard for our health index. We've done a standard for condition assessment and guidelines. So a huge amount of documentation has been done. And having got that, we can now start doing audits and compliance and training against those for the inspectors and engineers to make sure we get sort of consistent factors built into this little black box there. And we need to move away from the picture in that center there, which is one of the piers on the old Bridge 1 Rappahoe Bridge down in Greymouth, which I personally had a love relationship with. That was one of the better piers. We eventually did replace the bridge, but it did more than 100 years of life. So it carried coal trains till the day that it was demolished. But having said that, we can't rely on scary photos to get money. It doesn't work. Maybe work once, but not always. Anyway, so we came up with the Structures Health Index. And our health index or health management of structures has been around for decades. It's nothing new. It's a concept that's been well established. But we thought, well, we need to find the mathematics around that. And the output really needs to be a performance score for the bridge, a risk prioritization, and a 10-year forecast for investment. That was the fundamentals when we started off. And it hasn't changed. Our current asset management plan still calls for a 10-year plan. And this week, as we speak, we are still putting those plans together, which is great. We have the information now. And I've highlighted quality data. You cannot do anything without quality data. It's an old thing about garbage in, garbage out. In asset management, if you don't have accurate data and the right data, you can forget it. You're just, you may as well, wait for the American election results. The one thing, I thought I shouldn't mention politics, but anyway, the one thing that is also quite good to know is that last year there was a Ministry of Transport and Transport conference whereby they discussed certain things about the transport system in New Zealand, and resilience and security is one of the key factors there. But one of the goals of that conference was to talk about the importance of data-driven decision making. and the importance of data and quality data in making decisions. So evidence-based decisions around asset management. So we are certainly on the right track, to use a pun, but it was reassuring to hear that. So where we are sort of roughly at the moment is we've got a standard. We call it the Structures Health Index. I'd like to refer to it more like a performance index. It gives us the ability to look at an asset like a bridge and actually categorize each of those key risk factors, right? And by the end of that process, we end up with a score. Out of a score of 1 to 100, 100 being great, 1 being really not bad, really bad. But anyway, we can now calculate a number. And when you've got a number, you can start looking at the digital world and process that. And that's really first step where we want to end up with. I spoke about the data we have. We have a lot of information. We've had historically a lot of information in different formats. So we have, for example, looking at condition. We had condition reports in cupboards. We could then extract information out of that. We had risk assessments done by consultants in previous years. They used a certain matrix and ranking. Others did another ranking. So we had to normalize the information in all these studies into a 1 to 4. We decided a 1 to 4 sounds good. We'll normalize that by judgment into a 1 to 4 standard. And once we've got that now, we can actually move forward to start doing comparisons between different data sets and different systems. The bottom left-hand corner, I've highlighted, you may not be able to read it, but it says found information gap. And that we introduced as a risk factor as well. It's not a technical factor, but it is very important when it comes to data. And if we don't know anything about a bridge, that's a huge risk for us. That really is when things start falling to pieces. You don't even know there's a problem. So we put that in there as a factor so we can start looking at that could drive certain decisions for investment. We don't know anything about the bridge. We need to do an assessment, give us some money to do it. So, and when we get more information, that score goes down and the overall health improves. So I'll flick through these quickly. Some of the documentation we have. So we've got a guideline for the inspectors and engineers and in terms of condition rating. What do we mean by a 1 to 4 for a steel member? How do we rate that? And we came up with a guideline, a book, saying this is, if you see that's roughly that, probably it's a 2 or a 3. Remembering that the inspectors do that, and then it comes back to engineers, we do a review, and we end up with an agreed score. The same for strength. We could map that against our current loads and future-proofing loads. And seismic at this stage is probably the area we are but exposed. We can rank bridges in terms of location and hazard zones, but we haven't really looked at the individual bridges as such. And we've now got a pilot study in the Wellington region where we've come up with a seismic screening model, and we're going to be piloting that to see whether we can enhance our knowledge, looking at the types of structures, get a better score on the seismic side. That will probably trigger then detailed assessments on certain bridges, which is really going to be a good process. Right, so when we got to that point, we had to sort of somehow agree or decide whether we're on the right track. And so we took some historical information on about 100 bridges which hadn't gone through this process, and we actually scored them and ranked them to the best of our ability, and we plotted them out. So that was this plot. So between 100 north at the bottom, 100 at the top, that was sort of roughly what those risk or health scores came to. We then said, right, so when we plot our temporary speed restrictions on top of that, for each of those bridges, where would they be? And those are the red dots. We also have things called permanent speed restrictions, which means it's just there for a long term. We added that to the mix, and we went and said, well, which of these bridges historically do we know we currently doing monitoring on? And those were the ones that came up. So when you combine that, we looked at that and said, well, actually, that's not bad, because we would expect the bridges with low scores in the health sort of range to have restrictions on them. So you're going to get to a point where you start restricting operations on a bridge before you do major refurbishment. So the outliers on the right-hand side wasn't that bad. It was only 4. But fundamentally, we said, well, that looks reasonable. So we could proceed. Now it gets interesting, because the holy grail of asset management is levels of service. And in organizations, that is probably the hardest thing to define, looking at customer needs and all kinds of other things. Someone can give us a target that we want to aim for, be brilliant. And I would challenge a lot of organizations to say they have got that absolutely nailed, that everybody understands what the level of service means. So we as structural engineers went back to our roots and said, look, no one's telling us or asking us what, we're not getting that guidance. So let's just take a stab. So we looked at our 1-to-4 ratio and we said, look, those are sort of lines where we would think from a condition point of view would be reasonable. So if we look at that, we said, okay, anything below that red line, about a 35 score, we would call intolerable risk zone. Now, intolerable, we chose that not as safety, but as intolerable, because it's not a safety issue. We will always have safe operations of our bridges. Even if we have to close them, it will be safe. It just means that we shouldn't be in that area. Well, if there's no good reason to be there, we should get out of there. Then we have what I call market tolerated risk zone. And that's a sort of an area where you say, well, if there are restrictions on that bridge and the client doesn't worry, then it's fine. You don't have to go and remove all speed restrictions. So as long as the customer doesn't really care how his product gets from A to B, he doesn't care whether we have diesel locos or electric locos. He just wants to get his product. And that's the area that we could say, well, it depends on the organization and the customers as to what we do on that bridge. The next one up is really that resilient zone. We defined it as resilient, but needs a bit more context. But you would expect that if you're in that zone, your bridges will have to be pretty damn good in all of these risk factors, be resilient. And then if we build a new bridge, well, that's future-proofed. Current loads, future flooding, climate change, all improved. So that was, and that is still at the moment our sort of zones that we're working towards, or targets. And that is going to be an ongoing discussion as to how relevant that or accurate that may be. And it doesn't matter if we change them, the data is still going to be there. So just a quick example to show how this works. So that's a bridge in the Wairarapa, 114. It's a bridge with known scour and pier stability issues. It's got TSRs on it, or it had. And so we did a little exercise and said, right, let's rank it. So if you look at those factors, the condition is great. Really, it is nothing wrong with that bridge. Strength-wise, it is 2. It can carry 18 tons, no issue. Fatigue, all the spans are well within their fatigue life. But when it comes to foundation and seismic and scour, it really gets ranked quite low. And then we have a knowledge gap, which wasn't too bad. We had as-builts. So we got a score of about 50, which means nothing to investors. Really, it means something to us. So the solution there popped up, well, actually, if we don't have to replace the bridge, we can just underpin the piers and we'll take away the risk factors of scour and seismic, which is what we did. And it didn't cost an arm and a leg. And we did the reassessment, and the score now went to 75. Now, all I'm saying here is that we now have a measure, a story to tell to investors saying you've spent 2 million on this bridge, you've taken the health from there to there. And that on that graph of ours, the level of service has gone up. At least we can now start telling a corporate story as opposed to an engineering one. And that's as simple as this process is with the right amount of data. If you take it on a network basis, if you have scores for each bridge on your network, you could rank them, you can pull into one line at the right-hand side there, and you know that that is the lowest and the highest, or the scattering of your health scores. If your customer and the organization tells you, we want to actually operate in that band, the requirement is to be between 100 and 50, well, we know what the gap is. We know which bridges to go and look at, and we can then put that into a forwards work program, and everybody can say, yes, we're comfortable with that. Do we do it in 1 year or we do it over 10 years? Doesn't matter. But at least we've now got a definition of which ones do we tackle and which ones do we leave. That has resulted in us coming up with a prioritized list of our bridges, all of our risk factors. When I say all, I'll come back to that. We have a framework now where we can start plugging the data in, and we've got a 10-year forecast with strategies. And that little red button you see there is now available to us. We can actually now press the button, very quickly tell people, yep, our top 10 bridges are those ones. Those are the scour problems. You can see them on the graph there, actually. And out of that, we've written a 10-year investment plan to support our asset management plan, which is going into our funding cycle right now. So I guess moving back to 2016, the red button is now there, and I can push it, and it'll give me an answer. It gets better, and this is where we've moved on. since the last time we discussed this. Now that fundamentally is a spreadsheet, and Mike's not here. Grey hairs is probably growing. But we've now actually taken all of this and we put it into our asset management system called Maximo. So we can get all this information out of Maximo. And it gets really good because on the condition side of things, the inspectors in the field, when they push their red button, all of that condition information for each bridge, for each member that has been rated, gets sucked into Maximo instantly, and we get an updated score for that condition. The engineers then come back and they plug in the engineering risk factors once they've assessed them. So out of the 1,500 bridges we have, which are active, we've now got about 430 bridges assessed in this first round. And because we've got a 6-year cycle for detailed inspections, every 6 years we will update not only the condition, but all these other risk factors as well. So it'll take a while to get there. We can make it quicker. But at the end of all of this, when I turn back to the risk-based system, the ideal is that we don't have to go out every 6 years. We can go for a particular bridge, we can go every 20 years or 15 years. But it has to be coupled to the health or some kind of measure. And we now have the ability to say, okay, for those bridges between that band, we can go every 10 years, rather every 6 years. So the potential of using this information is now becoming really tangible and good for the future. Ongoing system, I'll rush through this really. It's data collection, and I'll go back to that slide where I talked about the safety of the health and safety of people. So we've been using drones for many years now, actually. I think with some of the earlier uptake of it. And it's been helping our inspectors to do their general inspections, and in some cases getting access for detailed inspections. And with the definition of cameras getting better and better while it's getting easier. And they're getting smaller and less likely to fly into the bridges now these days. So that's great. They've got their tablets. They can now actually do mobility in field and upload data. Not perfect. There's a few things to niggle out, a few niggles to sort out still, but it's definitely the process is in place. And then real-time instrumentation. We have a couple of bridges where we do this, but I'm very strong on convinced that before you embark on going to instrument your bridges as a substitute for visual inspection and those sort of things, you really need to know what your issue is you're trying to solve. Why are you going to put those things on the bridge, and what are you going to do with the information? Don't know that. It's lovely to have these drafts and dashboards and impress people. And where we do have to, we install that and we follow through. The challenge is going to be with all the gazillions of gigabytes being generated, as to how we store that and how we process that in our systems. And I think the limitation will eventually be, not a limitation, it's getting bigger and bigger. The clouds are getting bigger. We'll have more space, but you need to be able to retrieve that, the overload of information that this green, you need to filter it out into data that we can understand and use. I think that is about as much as I need to say. And I'm more than happy to take some easy questions.
Nice one, Rudolph. We're going to start with questions in here while we just get the organise ourselves on the IT. So I made some diligent notes as you were presenting, and I was impressed that you showed Bridge 1 Rapahoe, which I remember from time with Johnny Royal and John Winter, who literally spent a lifetime working on that bridge. So that would have, for those that don't know, it was I can't remember the type of timber truss, but it was an S-curve, unique in the world, timber truss bridge that you would probably have said was in your intolerable risk zone now.
It would definitely have been down there. So at the time that we started looking at the bridge, the coal trains were going across at 5 k's an hour. It was just about the train driver or the engineer, local engineer, walking ahead of the train. But they took 2 trains a day, fully laden, 16-ton axles. But the pier movements, for example, were like a 200mm movement when the train went over. And I experienced that and nearly jumped into the Grey River at that point. It was clear that the bridge had really seen its day, but it was still performing a function. And so at the end of the process, we did extensive analysis and came to the conclusion that it had to be replaced. It was a sad decision because it was a beautiful bridge and it had been built in the 1896. roundabout there, and we're still fulfilling its function. So, yeah, it was a good introduction to KiwiRail or on-track assets.
Nice one. So we'll go around the room first. So if you just put your hand up, I'll give you the mic, and then people will be able to hear you. So we're after impressive questions. Mark.
Hi. I was just wondering if you were considering from a customer perspective the actual routes themselves, like the premium route versus a slowpoke timber train.
Okay, that's a very good question, and I actually omitted to say this. I should have. What we came to a conclusion really early on, we tried to introduce risk factors, positive risk factors, overlaying all of our technical risk factors, which determined what line are we talking about, how important is the line, what number of freight does it carry, those sort of things. And we decided early on to not do that. So we've focused absolutely on the technical risk profile for a bridge. Doesn't matter if it's in Hokitika or wherever, this is not going to change. No matter, the only way we can change this is we change gravity and things like that. But overlaying all of this is still the corporate customer view. And that's why I'm coming back to the point of saying, if people are happy to have that bridge in that condition with those restrictions on a line, on the Ojai line down south, that's fine. We'll maintain the bridge as best we can. If the maintenance starts blowing out, we'll do what's necessary, but we don't have to go and replace the bridge. If that bridge was on the NIMT, it would be a different story. I think people would say we don't want a TSR on it. But we haven't mixed the two. We've kept that really separate for hopefully a good reason.
Cool. Got a couple here. We'll go Alan first.
Rudolph, in my time at KiwiRail, I always remember the 6-year detailed bridge inspections. Are you now in a position where you can now vary those periods, or are you still sticking with 6-year detailed for good bridges and bad bridges?
Yeah, we are still sticking with the 6 years for now. Till we have a really good data set, I would say more than 50% of our bridges in this process, I would rather stick with the 6-year cycle. We do have still the supplementary interim inspections we can do to go and address certain risks we have identified. But I don't think we're right now. We can actually say if a bridge score is this much, we can go every 10 years. Look, new bridges, no problem. We certainly won't be going back every 6 years. We would probably push it out to 12 years or maybe longer. The new ones being constructed right now. But when we're looking at the older stock, I would say I'm a bit cautious still to say.
Okay, so you've got a regime now where you've got the discretion for new bridges to make it.
Yeah, it's a discretion that I would say I have. We haven't got it written into a code yet, which would be something we have to do. And so, right, because in Australia, the roading authorities would connect their inspection cycles with their risk calculations based on the conditions. So it's possible, but I don't think we have the data set yet to do that.
Cool. We'll just do a few more in the room. So Merv, you've got one.
Oh, here comes a difficult one.
Merv Harvey, former railway guy. What I was just interested in, while you talk about working out what's intolerable and what's not and that kind of thing, are you happy at the moment with the investment you're getting? Because one of the big issues was always just how much capital, how much maintenance money did you get? So is that actually satisfying the structure at the moment?
I'd have to be honest and say we probably know, but I'd qualify that by saying that if you look at the asset management plan that we have now put together, and the 3-year and 10-year investment bucket that we're looking at accessing through NZTA and NLTP funding, that looks much better. But historically, yes, we've had an annual slice of budget, and that has been very, very hard to actually manage. But given all of that, I think we've managed to maintain the risk profiles to a level that I'm comfortable with. We could certainly do with more money, but I think other people like John might say, no, I want more for signals. And Mark Fleet would take everything for track, and the ferry guys would take it for ferry. I mean, it's like, so I think the challenge, the next step, big challenge for this system, if other disciplines adopt a similar type system, if we can what's the word I'm looking for? Naturalize all the scores into a comparable score, then we can start saying, well, given a track asset or a bridge asset, how can we compare them? But I think we're probably a way off on that. So signal guys would say, if it light doesn't come on, we've got to replace it.
Cool. So we'll just jump online, and just for those online, feel free to post questions, and great if you can put your name, then it just makes it a bit more personal. So Rudolph, first one. In asset management strategies, where is the corrective maintenance on the chart, as it only shows preventative and routine maintenance?
I'd say corrective maintenance and preventative maintenance depends how you define those things, but it's certainly part and parcel of that. When I don't think I've left it out on purpose. So corrective maintenance is definitely something that, in a regional sense, given our regional gangs and inspections and stuff, that gets prioritized within Maximo, and work orders generated based on the inspection. So it happens. And I think the difficulty we have is all these buckets that we're trying to define where the funding comes from. But at the end of the day, to me, if a cap needs to be replaced or strengthened, that needs to happen. Where the money comes from, that is something we need to actually make sure that happens.
So I'm having fun with the microphone here, so hopefully people don't hear me cursing into it offline. But I accidentally deleted that one, so I think I can remember what it was.
Good,
it was along the lines of when you have an actual renewal on your deterioration or your asset management curve. Not sure that was showed on there. Do you?
There's one of those diagrams where, yes, if you go back to a point where you've actually renewed it, then it jumps up to the same performance again. I can maybe just flick back. Bear with me for a minute. It's not doing what I wanted to do. Okay, it's just going to be painful, but anyway, enjoy the show as we go along. I think when you sort of renew, you would be putting that structure back at 100%, or close, and then you're going to start the process all over again. I'm just going to. Now, there's a quicker way of doing this, but hey, just bear with me. I've gone past. Okay. There we go. This looks very familiar now. I should do it more often. So on that figure there, where we got this minimum level of service on the right-hand side, when you upgrade it or renew it, depending on what you want to call it, it goes back to where it really fundamentally was. But if standards have changed, well, obviously, it's going to be higher than what it started off at. I guess the key thing for us as level of service thing as well is that as soon as we have a level of service change, that would also trigger certain investment criteria, other than just maintaining a certain load capability, for example. If people now want 20 tons, we would probably have to invest more to get the structures up capable to do that.
Cool. Next one is from Riet. So comparing KiwiRail inspection levels to your experience with Australian inspection levels, and possibly, was it roading that you were involved in there?
Yeah,
so your comparison of did you adopt, or do you think it's comparable, the inspection levels, KiwiRail New Zealand Rail versus Australian road type inspection levels?
I do believe some of the rail organisations there may have adopted similar approaches, but yes, in general terms, the level 1 inspection in Australia equals our general inspection that we would call it here. In the NZTA world, that will be sort of your annual inspection, I imagine. So that's pretty much still that safety walkover type inspection. The level 2 inspection in Australia, which is our condition assessment detail inspection 6-yearly cycle one, is comparable. However, in Australia, certain states, it's interesting to note that not all states are equal in Australia. I won't go into the NRL or anything like that, but or who holds which cup. But Victoria, for example, would not be doing intrusive testing under their detailed inspection on level 2. They would leave that. They'll come back later and do drilling of timber. They won't do it during that level 2. So, but most of the other states would be doing the drilling as we do during our detailed inspection. So yes, it is comparable. Yep.
Cool. So this one, I think from Ali. So considering the strategic importance factor for calculating your health index, but also accident history, and possibly in New Zealand we might say incidents. So yeah, it's a couple of stages in this question. So maybe just on that piece to start with.
So I'm assuming what you're saying is it's like what incidents have occurred on a particular bridge and how do we record that? Yeah, so any incident on our network gets recorded, logged in our, which is now called Aura system, and it's logged as an incident. And if it was, for example, a derailment on a bridge or close to a bridge, there will be an investigation launched into that. And it depends on the level of, severity of that incident. But typically, if we had a derailment on a bridge, there would be an investigation as to why it happened and what the effects may have been. As to whether we've started putting that into our overall health score, no, we haven't done that yet, but it's a risk factor. For example, we do have bridge strikes. So we have a road under a rail bridge. We have quite a few of those where the trucks will hit the bridge, etc., etc. We have that as a risk factor in our system. So we do cater for that kind of incident.
In the strategic importance piece, I think you mentioned before on the customer acceptance, so OHI versus the trunk, but it was just whether there was some formalizing of that. You might have already
not within our system, but there is a corporate system whereby they look at, maybe John, you could help me out here. There is certainly an overlay of line importance in terms of freight, metro, those sort of factors are definitely built into a corporate strategic network model. All we do is we feed our information into that. We've tried not to mix the two up because it gets too hard.
Okay, the next one from Piers. So from your experience with Australian road authorities, have you adopted some sort of common component identification matrix so that inspections are completed consistently across the network? And yep, a bit more on that theme. And then, because I think I know the answer to this, have you adopted some sort of common component identification with some of the other disciplines like track engineering within KiwiRail? So
of course, Dan, you have.
Things are called. I can keep going with the question if you want.
A pedestal on a bridge is the same as a pedestal on the ground. We have actually standardized, yes, but that has been standardized for many years already. We've tweaked some of the definitions and descriptions. So one of the battles I had with Michael Berry, which I lost, was changing Pier 1 to abutment A. That never changed because KiwiRail Pier 1 is abutment A, but in Australia it is abutment. So I lost that one and that's fine. But no, we don't have the problem of different states having different systems. I can mention that when I did work in the art group on deterioration modeling and looking at all the Australian states, one of the key things that we struggled with was the fact that they defined their components and elements differently. We couldn't find total common ground as to how we're going to name them. You've got to have consistency in your systems of how you label these things. We are blessed with one government.
So side one of a bridge is equal to
left-hand
rail, maybe?
Side one on our bridge is still side one in Australia. Yeah.
Okay, I'm coming from the track point of view.
Yeah.
Next one. So, all right, interesting. Who makes the final call for an asset replacement? And that's from Amir.
Oh, that's a very good question. I hate saying that the system does that because it isn't really true, because we do provide, when we do a submission for funding, we write a mini business plan as to covering all the risks and issues that are on that bridge and why we believe technically it should be funded and replaced. But then overlaying that would be the corporate sort of, well, is that in the best interest of KiwiRail to spend the money on that bridge and possibly not on another piece of, wagon or loco or something? And then those decisions are certainly not mine to make. The recommendations I make is to technically which ones should be replaced. And all of the data and evidence we provide with that, hopefully, we'll put that one top of the list. And if funding then comes through and everybody and all the stars are aligned, it will get funded. And that'll be by drawing a line on the spreadsheet, and anything above gets funded, anything below gets deferred. That's very simple.
Cool. We've just got a couple more online, but we've got at least one more in the Wellington team. Joel.
Thank you. Hi, Rudolph.
Joel.
What do you think the biggest risk is with having a purely numerical risk-based system? Do you think there's any potential holes?
Yeah, I think there are risks associated with that. And I would definitely never, hopefully ever be reliant on a number to give me a decision. There are systems out there, deterioration modeling systems, which are geared towards that. It will drive certain decisions, which goes back to possibly we'll replace that bearing in year 20 and that's it, regardless. Now, I think definitely there needs to be a level of technical judgment and expertise in the organization to support all of this. It cannot just stand on its own as a digit somewhere in a spreadsheet. No. So the engineering judgment and expertise definitely, to me, is definitely important.
And as a follow-up, have you done any kind of testing to see if you could find a hole in the system by, what to say, destruction testing? But have you?
Well, some of the testing we've done has been, for example, not maybe answering your question, but we do have a typical timber test bridge in Hamilton. We have annual inspectors conferences where we get together, and based on all these changes we've done the last few years, we've got these new systems and condition assessments. We've trained the inspectors through on that process, so that from a data point of view, we get consistent outcomes. And there's been really good correlation on how we perform. So that's pretty good. As far as whether we've got a bridge out there that our system says it's 20 and actually it's 100 or vice versa, that gets done pretty much every 6 years, because there is a reality check on what does this tell us, supported with all the photos and the inspector's report comments and stuff. So I think we haven't found holes yet. What our holes are is the lack of data in certain areas. That's pretty much it.
We've got a couple more online, but is there going to be any others from the crowd? No? Okay.
Can I ask a question as well?
Can you ask a question of yourself?
What is the score in America at the moment?
Florida's gone the
Okay.
which way? The right way? The left way? I'm
not
not sure.
I would not comment.
What you call it? Okay. So your thoughts on deterioration models for bridges?
Okay. In a nutshell, I think it's a very complex area. There is certainly a lot of good stuff all over the world that does try to there are models out there that would give you a deterioration curve, etc., etc. And the sophistication is really enormous. You've got neuralistic systems, you've got Markov chain systems, you've got a whole bunch of things. In America, a lot of the states do a multiple linear regression on their data set. So they've got 40 years of information, condition states on members, so they can really do that. It all depends on the data. So I guess I'd say my personal feeling is I'd be hesitant to go and get a thing off the shelf, just plug it into our system and believe it. It has to be calibrated. It has to make sense in terms of what we're trying to achieve.
Cool. So we've got two more, and then your fellow author, Mike Keenan, has saved up some questions to try and trick you.
Tell him he can answer them himself.
No. So any trends that you've come across when you've been doing the health index that have been a learning, such as something around age or type of structure, that's been a bit of a learning of an aha moment?
I'll have to think about that. There have been learnings. I think age is one of those things which a lot of people ask for. What is the age distribution of our bridges? And I know the accountants like age because they can depreciate things and they can do all kinds of weird things with those numbers. You know, the 1 + 1 = whatever. But fundamentally, age to me is not, and I'm speaking as an older person now, age is not a barrier to performance at all. So you can have an 80-year-old bridge still doing fit for purpose service on a network. And so I would not put age in there as a really determinant factor. In fact, we haven't included it in our scoring system. We stepped away from that for that purpose because we have these old bridges. I mean, other asset owners may have very young bridges. It's not an issue for them. They just go and inspect them and they patch up a few concrete patches here and there every year. We really are on that sort of, in some cases, on that downward trend of the graph.
It was 80 years was the average. So
yeah, 80 years.
Not much more than potential American presidents.
No,
so the score is it's 205 to 171 for Biden, but I think Trump's making quite a move because that's been, well, it's getting close. Last one from online. So the risk factor scoring typically have a range of 1 to 4. So sometimes 1 to 5 is favoured. So and do you weight particular things more? So your weightings on those.
Yeah. So 2 things there. One, we chose 1 to 4 purely because we didn't want to have something in the middle. Because research in America has shown they use a 1 to 9, 1 to 10 scale. When they did a lot of analysis on their states and data, they found that basically all the inspectors there, it always bands around probably a 4 to 5 range. And it's very much in the middle. It's never in the extremes. So we said, look, let's make it 1 to 4. 5 we use for condition assessment where something is broken. Obviously, you have to have thing that says it's broken. You can't run trains. It is a 5. That's the same in Australia. That some of the states have that thing as well. So when it comes to how do we have built into our system, because we've broken down our models in Maximo of the bridges. This is not a structural analysis model. This is a representation of the bridge and the componentry. Each of the critical members like beams, piles, and others which are really critical members, we have weighted them more than the others. So if there's a beam that is in the condition state 4, gets weighted higher in the scoring than piece of bracing in the condition state 4, for example. The beam will bring the bridge down, for example. The bracing wouldn't necessarily. But we've built that into our scoring system. And ultimately, it still relies on engineering judgment to say, well, yes, we need to intervene right now or not.
Nice one. Okay, so we'll finish with 2 questions from your co-author who's not here. So can you define resilient really, really fast?
No.
And what?
Mike, you should know. It's the top end of the yeah. I think there is currently no immediate response to that. It really depends, as the politicians would say.
And we'll finish with what do you do if the health index answer is 42?
I would, Mike, I would put my thumb out the door and hitchhike to the next galaxy.
Some will know the answer. Well done. Nice one. Okay, so that's the end of that. We hope those online have enjoyed it. Those here have had a chance to have a beer while watching or asking questions. So we've got those events coming up. Hopefully people can come in and attend those or attend them in person. Thanks very much to Rudolph. If everyone could give him a thank you. And enjoy the rest of the night and watching the results come in. Thank you.
Thanks.